everyone, and welcome back. We are tackling a big topic today. Not only am I going to be talking about the mythology behind the Mad Hatter, but I'm also going to be making a hat. I need to do that as my final piece for Gonzo's ensemble from the Muppets Christmas Carol, but I discovered that, well, I find top hats to be incredibly interesting to make. I had a lot of fun going through the process of it. The actual information around them was not that entertaining. So basically, top hats come in the 1790s and they're still around today. They do come in lots of different shapes and sizes, but the general process and trimming and function of them is really similar through all of that time. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when I actually show you the making of the hat, but I figured it would be much more interesting to dig into the big cultural concept that is the Mad Hatter. Because even if you know that the idea of the Mad Hatter is sourced in the use of mercury in the hat making process, you probably are like me and don't necessarily know why they used mercury in the process, why they continue to use something that they knew was poisonous and dangerous, because they did know. And why it continued for seemingly so long. How did we end up with this cultural stereotype out of it, a character, a trope out of it? How is it such a big deal and yet continued? It seems to not really make sense. I started off looking for any articles or mentions of Mad as a Hatter, Mad Hatter, mercurial processes, and hat making, found lots of different references. They seemed very aware of the potential danger of using mercury in hats to the hat makers. This was something that they are talking about early on in the 19th century. It's not something that suddenly springs upon them later, which just made me question even more, why do they continue to use it? I mean, I assume this is going to come down to the manufacturer's decision to use it, but why were people putting up with it if they're dealing with potentially a lot of health issues? Because here's the thing, and this is really important as to why I consider it a myth of a Mad Hatter. The Mad Hatter that we know is rambunctious and loud, unpredictable, and outgoing. In reality, the symptoms of mercury poisoning are not that at all. For most people, they found that these symptoms tend to be shakes and tremors, that they had issues with their gums and teeth, they tend to salivate more, and this causes all sorts of dental hygiene issues, that it could start affecting their brain, but usually the symptoms that you have from that are forgetfulness, that the person becomes very timid and quiet. They can be a little bit confused as well because of all of those things, but it's not an outgoing and loud confusion. They tend to just pull back into themselves and be very, very quiet. So that's exactly the opposite of the trope we have of the Mad Hatter, but that doesn't really help us fully understand the phrase Mad as a Hatter, which seems to be well ensconced by the 1840s. So obviously there was a notable health issue with these people that were being exposed to mercury during the hat making process. That leads us to try and understand where the mercury comes in and how this happened and why it is a specifically 19th century and a little bit into the early 20th century problem. Why we don't think of it as something that goes really far back. That's because the idea of using mercury in the hat making process is something that's either a 17th or 18th century invention. I couldn't find exact dates on this, I'm still going to keep looking, but almost all the modern articles that I found cited one source if they cited anything at all, and most did not, and that was a book from the 1970s on the history of mercury. And I have definitely learned over the years to not necessarily trust things very far back in historical research. The further back you go, the less information they had available to them, the lower the standards were of citations. I have yet to be able to lay my hands on this particular book in order to double check whether it has proper citations in it or not, or this was just something that the person made up, but they claimed that it came about in the 17th century because urine was used as part of the hat making process early on in the felting part, and they found that the urine that came from people that were being treated with mercury for syphilis was better at this job than others. Feasible, but that's the sort of history that usually we find a lot of questions with. So I wouldn't put much stock in that, but I have yet to find exactly when this started. But I can say that it is well ensconced and well used by the point that we reach the 1830s. They're talking about it as something that has been done for a while. They do mention it as potentially some secret recipe that came from the French, but other articles mention that this is something that is completely made up and that people knew how to do this before. It's not a big deal. So, where does mercury come into play? Why is it so necessary? Why is it so popular? Why is it some secret French invention that everyone decided to pick up? And the answer to that is that mercury is used really early on in the process of hat making. These are specifically fur hats. You can also have fabric hats. You can do a silk plush, like a silk velvet. You can do straw hats, all sorts of different styles. But specifically when we are talking about fur and felting up fur, and this can be fur from beavers or fur from rabbits or lots of other types of animals. You go to Australia in the 19th century, they were talking about using kangaroos and other native animals in order to get the fur that they needed in order to make hats because, you know, rabbits and beavers aren't really available to them. But they take these hides from the animals and they remove the fur from them. And part of the process of taking the fur off of the hides is called kerating. And it is where they take a mixture of mercury, nitric acid, and water, and they apply it to the pelts. This turns them a bright orange, which is where the term kerating comes from because it's the color of carrots, and then they will cut the fur off of the pelt. You get a whole range of different types of fur off of different animals. Sometimes you have very long guard hairs that will be removed. You have really fluffy undercoating. That's particularly good for felting up, and there's a whole range in between. But the key factor in all of this is that you need something that's going to grip to itself really well. And things like wool tend to do this because they're very scaly. And so those scales do a great job of gripping and felting. And in order to take the fur from these different animals and get the same attributes without having to, say, add wool to the mixture, you use that nitrate of mercury. And it raises the scales on the fur so that way it's more likely to grip to itself. There are other versions of this and different chemicals that are used. There's an option of using nitric acid and vinegar, but it is not quite as effective from what I could find, and therefore they very often had to mix in wool in order to get it to felt up properly, and the mercury option meant that you could actually use lower grade furs. You don't have to have the best quality. So it makes sense as to why it started being used. The issue then becomes not just the one person that is dealing with the kerating process. The issue becomes the fact that that hat has the entire rest of the process to go through before it makes it to a final product. And at different points throughout that process, that mercury is going to become dangerous again. Some jobs within the manufacturing don't seem to have issues and others do. And I found this one book from 1877 that went into great detail about every single step of the process, what sort of person was doing that job, and how much of a risk they had. They went through and interviewed all of the people in many different manufacturers, literally hundreds and thousands of people, because these manufacturers could have 1,500 to 2,500 people working in them each. And they talked to them about their job process, about any symptoms they might have, and any issues they found with their job. And so they go through step by step by step and talk about each one of those jobs, which I think not only is important to understand the risk of mercury, but is also pretty neat to see the process, because honestly, it's not terribly different than doing it by hand as an individual. So you're gonna see a lot of comparisons when I actually get to making my own hat. So we're starting at the point where we've removed the fur, the kerating process has already taken place. We then need to sort those fibers. And early on, this is done individually by a person actually sorting out each one of the little bits of fur into different piles of quality. But later on moves to machinery that blows the fur through different types of opening and sifts it down through other different sections. And it goes through a different series of machines, which not surprisingly kick a lot of that back up into the air. It's very dusty, it's very fuzzy, and generally there are a lot of respiratory issues within that department. Early on, when it was done by hand, it seemed to be done mostly by women. By the time they move on to using machinery for it, it is done by boys. Once all of those fibers are handled and sorted into the correct bundles, then the felting process can begin. And this goes through 5 different jobs in order to get from loose fibers into a solid piece of felt for hat making. We have weighers, feeders, coners, felters, and hardeners. The weighers and the feeders are dealing with the dry fiber. They don't seem to have the same health issues that you're finding from the other jobs, whereas the coners, wetters, and hardeners are dealing with the wet format of felting. So the coners are the ones that are actually shaping it into a cone shape in order to get the hat blank. And then it moves through the wetters and the hardeners, who are actually wetting it down and doing all the agitation to get it to felt up. And so they are dealing with a lot of water, which is just picking that mercury back up, and now you have a lot of mercury in your water, and they're getting that all over themselves, and it's up in the air, it's up in those fibers. And the only things that they are doing to protect themselves tend to be that some of these people are issued or choose to wear rubber gloves, which we now know don't actually prevent that. We have plenty of modern evidence of situations where the mercury goes right on through latex rubber gloves, so that probably didn't save them from much. And they might choose to cover their nose and mouth in order to prevent some of the fibers from being inhaled, but again, not everyone's doing that. So not surprisingly, there's a lot of exposure in these jobs to the water, to the fibers, to everything else. And we've only just made it to the point where we have a hat blank. And this is stuff that I didn't even have to do with my hat, so that's how far back we are in the process of hat making. Still have a lot of people to go through. The next job is the sizer, or sometimes called the maker. They add sulfuric acid to the hat, which helps set things up and prepare it for the next step of the dryer or hardener. So they are the ones adding shellac to this hat body. So the shellac is what's going to give it that stiffness, that sort of knockable noise that you get off of finished hats. So they are the ones adding in the chemicals to give that stiffness. They did find in the research that there wasn't a large case of issues with these particular jobs, potentially that the chemicals were reacting in different ways, or they weren't reactivating the mercury, or because they were doing other careful things, because they were dealing with certain chemicals, they weren't getting exposure to the mercury in the same way. It's not to say they weren't getting exposure to other things, but at least they weren't having the symptoms of mercury poisoning. From there, we move on to the clipper that trims down all of those loose little fibers sticking up so it's nice and smooth and shiny, and then the blocker, who actually blocks the shape of the hat out. They did find some rise in issues with the blockers because they are steaming the hat body in order to get it to the point where they can shape it over the hat block. So there is some potential issue in there, but they're also getting most of their damage on their hands and their fingertips, which is as much due to the high steam and heat levels as much as anything else. So there weren't as many symptoms specifically of mercury poisoning, but there could be plenty of other health issues from that particular area. Then the hat moves on to the dyer, and they did find the dyers had a lot of health issues, but they also weren't sure if that was from mercury or from all of the chemicals in the dyes. So they just in general were really poorly off in that particular department. We don't know if that's mercury or something else, but they are dyeing the hat in whatever color it needs to be before it moves on to the pouncer. The pouncer will take a pumice stone or something of similar sort of roughness and end up again getting rid of those extra little fibers and hairs that are sticking up in the wrong places. This helps to smooth everything out. They do find health issues there because they're cutting these little fibers and getting them up in the air again. Eventually this job is done by machinery rather than by hand, and that job has a dramatically different level of mercury exposure once it's moved on to machines, which, because it's cutting all these little fibers, they have good ventilations, they have good fans for that. So they're finding that if they're just operating the machines, they are at much less risk. However, the next job apparently is the riskiest one, even including those that are doing the carroting themselves, because 63% of the reported health issues that were attributed to mercury poisoning came from the finishers. The finishers are the ones that are taking a hot iron and steaming the hat into its perfect final shape. They're setting the shellac, making sure that everything is the final form that it needs to be, shining it up and flattening it up. And this apparently is when it is the most volatile, dealing with that hot steam and really getting in there with their hands and having nothing that is helping to protect them. This is where most of the exposure seems to occur, almost all the way at the end. Because once it leaves those finishers, it moves on to being trimmed and finished with all of its ribbons and linings. And then it goes on to the flangers, who fix up the brim so it's just perfect. However, they do so by heating it in hot sand, so the exposure is dramatically different than over a steaming iron, and then they get packed up and sent out. So there are different levels of exposure in different jobs, not only because of the job itself, but also because the length of time somebody does that job. Jobs like trimming are usually done by young women, and they're only working there for a few months or a few years until they get married and start a family. Whereas other parts of the manufacturing process have older men in them, men that have been working there for years and years, if not decades. So inevitably the departments where you have a longer period of time someone works there, you're going to end up finding more health issues. And to make it a little bit more complicated, people do apparently move around from job to job, as they might find certain jobs have health issues for them. They will move to other positions within the manufacturer. But the thing is, and this is the really important part, these people that are exposed to mercury, these people that are being poisoned by mercury and having these health issues, were very often incredibly resistant to the idea. They didn't want to admit that they were sick. They didn't want to admit that these problems were as serious as they were. They would claim, oh, I have a completely steady hand, I don't have tremors, but it would be obvious to the person who was interviewing them. They would claim that these health issues come from other things, that, oh, the respiratory issues, that's just because we're breathing in fibers, it's not the mercury. And the reason for this is because, one, there is a level of pride to being healthy versus sick. Two, they didn't want to lose their job. There wasn't anything protecting them in the 19th century from being let go. So if they went to the manufacturer and said, I am having a health problem due to my job, they're not going to get compensation for that. They're not going to get sick time. They're just going to be let go if they refuse to just, at best, take a position in another part of the manufacturing process. But odds are they're just going to be told so. So these people don't want to be sick. They don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to cause a problem in the system. They want to earn money. And, well, those health issues are just part of it. Now, as for the broader scale, as for the manufacturers themselves, a lot of times they do put in effort to, say, ventilate better. They make sure that there are fans or open windows, that there's space, that they give people rubber gloves or whatever it is. But as we move further and further into the 19th century, the areas that are industrial are becoming more and more enclosed. It's no longer buildings on the outskirts of city limits where they can open up the windows and have airflow. Instead, they have to rely on mechanical fans and mechanical means in order to do this. People are working longer and longer hours, more and more days during the week, because now we have artificial lighting options and machinery that can continue to run for just 24/7. So there's more and more exposure. There's less and less airflow. The air quality outside is less and less healthy. And so these things are becoming more of an issue. And obviously, newspapers were aware of it, doctors were aware of it, the general public was aware of it, because otherwise why would you have the phrase mad as a hatter as a common phrase? It meant something. And so they were aware of this issue. But the thing is, there was very little anyone could do. The manufacturers, when they were accused of basically poisoning their employees, would claim that in fact these were not symptoms of mercury poisoning. They put forward all the effort they needed to do to make sure that their employees were safe from this poison. This was not poisoning for mercury. No, no. This was alcohol poisoning. This was tobacco. This was because the employees would go and do inappropriate things in their time off. They'd drink too much, they'd smoke too much, and that's why they had all of these health issues, because alcohol poisoning has not dissimilar symptoms to that of mercury poisoning. And so they were able to basically go through the standard claim of, well, these working class poor people just keep going and doing all these bad things they're not supposed to do. It's not my fault that they're doing that. It's not my problem that they're causing themselves all these health issues. Oh, So that was a typical thing in the 19th century, and that argument continued to work well into the 20th century, where people didn't want to rock the boat, they didn't want to lose their job, and it isn't until we get into that early 20th century and we get things like unions and groups that are putting forward a great deal of effort, not just in the streets with the public, but also in the government to get laws and regulations put into place. In America, the regulations banning mercury use in hatting was put in place in 1941, but a lot of places had already stopped using it by that point. In the 1930s, a hydrogen peroxide-based chemical compound was discovered that gave a similar effect to the nitrate of mercury, so it was no longer necessary to use quite as dangerous of a chemical compound. And of course, hat making is starting to change in terms of the demand for what type of hat, styles, or just demand for hats in general. So as we move through the 20th century, it would have lost its purpose anyway, even if those laws hadn't been put into place. There are still times where things are imported and they find mercury in them. It's still an issue. So obviously it's still considered a cheap and effective way of doing things, even with the new options. So it still continues to be a problem, but obviously at this point in time in modern day, hats are not the thing that they used to be. And so the hat making process, or at least the felting process of hat making, is dramatically different than it used to be. It still uses a lot of the same steps. We still have to get that animal fiber, but most of the time now it's rabbit rather than beaver, and they'll mix it with wool if they need to, but it's not taken as an entire pelt off the animal. It's removed from the animal as a loose fur, as a loose fiber, much the same way that they do yarn. So you don't have the same exact process at the beginning. Obviously the kerating process is completely different, but the setting process, the blocking, lacquering, all of those things are still very similar in their basic formats. And so that's what I get to show you today, because the work that I can do as a solo person in terms of making this hat is not dissimilar to what you would have seen throughout the 19th century, just without obviously all the industrial machines doing some of that work for me. So a little bit more elbow grease into this part of the process, but it's still going to be the same basic steps. Obviously, I am not at risk for being exposed to mercury since that's not being used anymore, but it's something that is incredibly important to understand about the process of hat making in the 19th century, because there were dozens of different jobs within one hat, and they all had different levels of exposure. They all had different issues. And obviously this was something that was a big enough problem that it made it into a cultural character, a cultural concept of mad as a hatter. The first item that I needed for this process is the hat block. Now, though I will make my own shoe lasts, I will not make my own complex multi-piece hat block. That's a little too much for me, so I ordered this one from Poland. You can see the pieces are needed because it is a curved style, meaning that it's concave, and I won't be able to just pull the entire thing out as one piece. So it needs to come in 5 pieces in order to work, and then the brim itself is also a separate piece, which just fits nicely at the bottom. I did realize I would also need a stand for this. Mine is just a one-hole stand, so it doesn't fit perfectly, but it works well enough for the purposes of blocking. Then we get into the other supplies like the shellac. These are shellac flakes, but I am using a pre-done shellac which already dissolves the flakes in isopropyl alcohol to make it easier for me, and that will just get brushed on later. To start with, though, we need to steam the hat. I've already wet it down in some hot water. You can soak it if you need to. They historically soaked them in boiling water in order to get to this point, and with enough steam from my kettle applied, I can start to stretch it into shape. I didn't get quite enough stretch on this first pass, so I'm just getting the rough shape in and then steaming it really well again. I find this is much easier than using my iron for steam and seems to be hotter than the steamers that you use for clothing. And on the second pass, I got much closer to the upper shape that I need. The rest of the lower part of the shape we will get as we go. So now that I have a good start, I can take the entire hat block with the hat blank on it and steam that directly. That allows me to continue stretching and pushing and pulling to get the shape where it needs to be. And essentially the process of blocking a hat, especially one that is this long and requires a cape line that wants to flare out too early, is to work it slowly and Just manage sections as you go, steam everything really well. You only have a few seconds after you steam it to get it to stretch and mold. So I'm just going around section by section, about 4 to 6 sections around the hat, doing a line around horizontally, doing the next line around, and gradually you can see I'm starting to get the correct shape. As you stretch downwards, it also contracts horizontally, which allows it to curve into that top hat shape. So it's going very well. This whole process just takes an hour or two depending on the complexity of your hat. If you're doing very simple styles, or maybe more of a cloche style, this can go incredibly quickly. But for me, working this style down, it took about an hour or two. You can see my hands picked up a lot of the dye from the hat as well, so keep that in mind. It took a couple days to get rid of that. At the bottom, I'm pinning some tape in order to keep the bottom shape nice and tight. I'm going to be putting on the brim section next, which is going to pull it outwards, and I want to make sure that there's enough tension, keeping it tight to the mold so it's not stretching out. I did realize at this point it's a little bit difficult to get the brim portion on, but it's still squeezed over. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit over the top of the crown. The hat is just a little bit bigger than the bottom, so the brim portion doesn't fit over that. A little bit difficult, but not too bad. Once I got that on, I then started steaming each section individually around the brim, working it up and around the shape. I didn't pull quite as hard as I did on the crown portion. This doesn't need to be stretched nearly as much, but because I'm needing to compact it in, it does need a little bit of upward stretching. There is a indentation the whole way around as to where the brim will need to stop and will eventually be cut. So I put a piece of cotton tape around that line to hold it into place. Once I got close to where it needed to be, and then I was able to steam, pull a little bit more, press it in a little bit more, get a really nice crease, so that way I have a very clean line that I will need to cut later. I then started brushing all of the fur into the correct direction. I want it going the right way before I put the shellac on. I also decided at this point to go ahead and start trimming off some of those errant little hairs that were sticking up. I used a very fine razor blade for this, and that made it super shiny once I brushed it down and got rid of all that extra little fuzz. Beautiful finish to that. It seemed like it'd be easier doing it now than after I've removed everything. And like I said, I wanted to make sure it was in a good place before I shellacked it down. Then chalked the edge so I knew exactly where I needed to cut just in case it shifted around after I removed the block. Took the tape off and realized that I wasn't going to be able to remove that brim portion from this angle because there's not enough space for that. It means that I need to remove the entire block system inside first. I had a little bit of trouble getting the center block free, so I sort of popped it with that peg on my hat stand. I was able to get the center block out. Then you remove the side blocks, which are now free, and then I can pop the two curved end blocks out. And once I've done that, it allows it to compact just enough at the very top of the crown that I can pop the brim portion out. And we have a fairly good shape to start with. I trimmed away the rough extra first before going back in and doing a very clean, precise trim right along the chalk line. This will be bound with ribbon, so it doesn't have to be exactly perfect. A little bit more brushing of the areas that were hidden by the block. Like I said, I want to get that in the right direction before I start adding the shellac, just because it will get really difficult for me to shift it around afterwards. So some brushing now will save me a big headache later. The shellac for the crown portion is done from the inside. You want to get a fair amount in there, rub it in really well with the brush. It shouldn't be fully saturated. You don't want this sopping wet, otherwise you're going to lose that work. It's going to get a little too squishy. So I just need a couple of layers at the very top of the crown, and then I just make sure I go around the interior a couple of times. The point where I start to feel dampness on the exterior is when I know I need to stop. The crown I did on one side, and then the next time I shellacked it on the other. I think I shellacked this a total of 5 or 6 times, letting it dry for a few hours in between. I am in the desert, so it dries pretty fast. At the end, the brim had changed shape a little bit, so I did the final shellacking on the stand, and then I ironed and pressed everything with heat into place along the brim to make sure it was the right shape in its final format. Could then move on to the lining and finishing. The antique that I have and most of the examples I could find online seem to be lined with a silk satin or a china silk, and at the very top of the crown sometimes they had a moire or some other fancier silk pattern like a jacquard. I have these two fabrics which I don't think are actually silk, but they're perfect for this. They're the right colors. So I'm using what is likely a rayon satin for the sides of the crown. This is cut on the bias so that way it can stretch around those curves. For the top portion, I'm going to cut a piece of heavy paper, something cardstock weight. And this needs to be just small enough to fit into the top of the crown and the inside, but no smaller because it's going to hold itself in place by pressure. You can shellac this and insert it, and I did find some instructions that told me to shellac it and make it up before putting the hat on the block, and that's part of the blocking process, so you can get extra tight. I did not do that. Instead, I'm relying on the fact that the fabric is going to add a little bit of bulk, and it will probably hold itself up there pretty well. If it continually falls down, I might add some shellac to hold it up a little bit better. For the upper part of the crown, I am using a moire fabric. Again, I'm pretty sure this is rayon and not silk, but I only have a very small portion of it, and it seemed perfect for that. I'm hoping in the future maybe I can figure out a way to print a little label on the top as well. The side walls then just get rain stitched to the paper and the fabric. Yes, you're putting holes in the paper. It's not a big deal. This is not fine stitching. It's going to be up inside the hat. This stitching and this method is based off of an original that I have. That's probably from the very end of the 19th century. This is the method that they used to stitch everything together. The only difference was they had paper added to those sidewalls to keep them flat and straight, but they also had a much straighter top hat, so I couldn't really do that with all my curves. I then stitched a wire around the edge of the brim. Again, this is something that is mentioned in historical instructions, so it is something that they did too. It's not just a modern millinery step. That then gets bound with a ribbon. I went with a fairly narrow grosgrain ribbon because one, that's the best match that I had color-wise, and two, I saw a lot of narrow ribbons in the 1830s and early 1840s, more wide ribbons as we went further into the century. For the interior hat band portion, I'm doing a white leather. This can be a brown leather. I also found a black silk twill option, but I liked the white leather because then I don't have to worry about any staining occurring to my forehead. This just gets whipped in around the edges, and at the back seam, the original that I have was actually done with a piece of paper that is pasted, so that way it pastes the two edges together. It's a really simple and quick way of doing that. For the exterior, the trim on this was a ribbon that I had a lot of trouble finding. I wanted something similar to the movie, and I just couldn't find it. This was the best that I could manage. It has an extra brown stripe compared to the movie version, but it's otherwise exactly the same. And because this Petersham ribbon is a little bit wider than a lot of the originals or the one in the movie, I couldn't tie a bow easily. So I decided instead to fold one. So I folded this initial loop on one end, and that will allow me to insert a folded bow through the other side. The nice thing is, I can leave this fairly long and only tack in a few places, so if I ever want to pop off this ribbon and use it for something else, it's really adjustable. I haven't cut it super short. And I'm just folding that bow into the right length in order to pass through at the center, tacking it down to make sure that it's not going to shift around, insert the folded bow through the loop, and you can either tack it by stitching or like I'm doing with a little straight pin. That means that this is really easy to remove and switch it out for any other type of hat band that I might want to change for the season or for the outfit. A final brushing to make sure everything is smooth and glossy, and we are ready to go.